everybody. All rise. Pledge allegiance. Led by Mr. Trevor James.
I'll make this a little easy. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Here. Councilman Garfield.
Here.
Councilman Scott. Here. Supervisor Martin.
Here. Okay, motion to approve the minutes for the previous meeting.
I'll make that motion to approve the minutes from last month's meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Reports to town officials. Go to the first.
Sure.
I wrote 2 permits for $75 last month, did 10 inspections, issued 8 CSCs, received 3 complaints, and got 3 complaints resolved. I also received a complaint letter from a local contractor. He didn't leave a name or a phone number or anything to respond to. He's complaining about 4 different properties not having permits. One was in the town, the other 3 were in the village, so I passed along to Mark Peak. And I talked to the new owner. He said he just remodeled kitchen cabinets, doing some drywall work, but so I didn't think there was a need for a permit. I checked out the dumpster, and that's all they had in the dumpster at that point, so some carpeting. But just so you're aware of what's going on, I don't know who it is. He didn't leave a name or a phone number or a return address, so just so you're aware.
Did your part. Any update with Sandhill?
No, we told you about the electrical inspection. The water bill's been paid in full, and I emailed her and then had her send us back as far as where they are with the septic issues, design. And we should wait for the weather breaks to remove some of the old homes and clean up the snow cover.
Which is understandable. Anything else?
I also received a letter from FEMA. They hired some engineers to reevaluate the floodplains in Wayne County. So there'll be surveyors and engineers walking around in the area. I think there's in the western part of the county at this point. Just so you're aware of if you get any call of what's going on, people wandering around the waterways in Wayne County. I also sent you guys the latest zoning update in the email. Look over, see if there's any changes, if you need to have a meeting on anything. You also need to decide on the mass gathering law, if you're gonna have one or not in the new zoning.
I think our last decision, we're gonna leave that alone for a while.
Okay.
Until we get the ordinance done.
Right.
We're gonna address it when it's complete.
Other than that, that's it.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, this winter's been a little warmer than most, but even with the temperatures around 30 degrees, we had to make 26 plowing or sanding trips since the last board meeting. Traffic on these fresh snow on the 30 degrees really packs it down by ice in a hurry. We also had 1 full night of freezing rain, and in our spare time, we've been hauling sand back in to restock our supply. That pretty much took care of our month's worth. And at our last meeting, we talked about upgrading our Caterpillar skid steer. I now have a solid quote for a new Caterpillar 246 D3 skid steer with a 24-inch coal planer. The full purchase price is $63,171. And we have a 2017 232D Caterpillar, which is a little bit smaller, but it has a trade-in value of $25,000, leaving a net trade of about $38,171. At the present time, we do not have a coal planer at all, and the machine we have is not heavy enough to handle one. We also have 4 tires that need to be replaced on the machine we have at a cost of $1,875. And it's my suggestion that we surplus our machine before we spend any money on tires or anything else and trade it in towards the new machine that will do the job we need to do. This purchase would be off of the New York State OGS NJPA Heavy Equipment Contract PC 66988. And the total cost to us would be $38,171. We have the money in the budget to make this purchase if the board chooses to move forward with it.
It's a coal miner.
A milling machine,
Oh,
24-inch milling machine.
yep, oh, okay.
Thoughts from the board?
That's something you use on a regular basis?
Yes.
Correct. And the new ones are available for delivery at what time?
They may have one in stock, if not, like 30 days.
Any other thoughts?
Huh?
No.
All for it.
Anyone wanna make a motion? Yes or no?
I'll make a motion for the purchase, for the town to,
Surplus.
surplus the old one and, put that money towards the new one, for the 24-inch coal planer.
Okay, with second, the motion was second?
Roll call, please.
Councilmember Leonard?
Yes.
Councilman Greco?
Yep.
Councilwoman Scotty?
Yes.
Supervisor Cookie?
Yes. Anything else? That's it?
Truck's been holding up pretty good through the winter.
Knock on wood, the one we had the motor repaired on is holding up good.
That's $600, man,
I'll tell you. Turned it into a machine again.
Yep, it's working. All the members.
$600.
I almost gave it to him, I forgot to put that in my report. It helped Sodas out here this past month too. He, was out before that ice storm, day before the ice storm there. He, had 3 trucks go down of the ones we had borrowed. And we only got the borrowed trucks he was using, and he had 3 of them go down, so we plowed and sanded up into Sodas a little ways in 3 or 4 different spots at the end of like Surge Road and, Maple Ridge and, the other one over there, Minstead. So that helped him out a lot, otherwise I was gonna let him use that right when we had the motor repaired in, but we helped him out enough so we could just move his trucks over and do what he could do with what he had. But he's back up now, so we're all set unless something happens to him again.
You never know.
You know, you don't, never know, we might need help someday.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zach.
Communications, I don't have anything, do you have anything in communications, Mike? Nothing?
Nothing here.
Nothing? What I'd like to do was move up Lavella, to now, so that they can do their presentation on solar. And, a lot of order, but I think we're okay.
Thank you for that. My name is Jerry Leone. I'm a civil engineer with Bell Associates. Appreciate the time this evening. I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity to develop a solar project at your close landfill site, off Route 88. I'm working on a number of these projects now across New York, closed landfills. I have 33 years of experience in solid waste. I spent 15 years of my career with waste management and another 13 with Casella before I joined Bella. I spent a fair amount of my career developing landfill gas to energy projects, taking biogas and making electricity. So the opportunity to do much of the same, except with solar panels, is pretty consistent. The utility interconnection and the permitting is relatively the same. So I've given you some background information here that I wanted to share. And I wanted to start by talking to you about the benefits of a project on a closed landfill, in particular solar panels. So they're already known to be an environmentally, what I'll call impaired property, sensitive piece of property. Technically or generally, there's relative less amount of residents that live near a landfill than otherwise. Usually there's pretty good security in the way of fencing. Typically there's pretty good screening in the way of trees or berms. And typically there's pretty good site access in the way of roads, both into the site as well as once in the site, around the site. And typically there's large flat open areas, existing spaces without trees, which of course is good for solar. And then there's opportunities for financial incentives for these types of projects. Being in the industry, I'm aware that a number of years ago, there was an effort to try to reopen the landfill. With a project like this would certainly impair it from that type of activity. Nonetheless, next page, the factors that contribute to a size of project. These are somewhat in order. The first of which would be the amount that the electric utility grid can host, or entertain, or accept. So that's really what drives the project. I'm going to show you a couple of conceptual layouts this evening, and they're all going to be predicated on just how much utility, if this were to go forward, could accept into the grid. There are certain pockets within their system where there are issues associated with capacity and congestion. And projects like this actually help the utility by energizing distributed energy into their system. So, as an example, electricity might very well be flowing here from Guinea. It makes its way into this system and it flows somewhat like water to where it's needed. So if the solar were to move into the system, it would just follow its path wherever it would need to go to energize the system. So there's certain pockets that the utility has where they're in favor, more so in favor of these projects because it actually helps reliability, as I suggest. Other factors that contribute is the economics. So if the project were to allow a larger array into the grid, it would cost more to build that. There's a factor associated with how open the land might be and how flat it might be. Considerations need to be given on shading. So you don't want the trees to shade, you don't want the panels to overlap each other. So there's considerations on the landfill that you don't want it to be too sloped for the reasons that I suggest. I want to make it clear that solar is, yes, a function of the sun, but it's all a function of light and daylight. So believe it or not, Germany leads the world in solar, and we have more daylight and sun than they do. So these panels, of course, would not work at night. There's what's called a capacity factor associated with how much electricity they would produce. So a generator, much like I alluded, that would run on landfill gas, would run virtually all the time, except for when it was down for maintenance, because the gas is there almost constantly. Here, in the case where the sun goes up and down, during the day, unless we had a battery charging station, which is now feasible, the electricity would only be generated during daylight hours. So we'd also want to avoid wetlands. Wetlands would need to be permitted in the case they were going to be impacted. Landfills generally are not, they're near landfills, but you don't see wetlands growing on top of landfills generally. They're properly maintained as a landfill. There's also, as we're going to talk about shortly, the New York State DEC, of course, has an interest in a project of this type, as there are a number of them under development currently. And then lastly, is the local approvals here with this board and with the town. The next slide, the DEC guidance that I made reference of, this is pretty much hot off the press. This was largely driven by projects that moved fairly quickly and didn't quite have the time of day with the DEC for them to properly weigh in. I'll suggest to you that the bulk of these requirements that I'm going to share are largely related to the protection of the integrity of the cap. So they want to be certain that the cap and the waste that remains entombed in the landfill are protected throughout the life of the project. And I guess I'll just back up if I could. What I mentioned about the layout, right now this is a fairly sizable array. And again, this is right on top of the closed landfill site. There's likely a chance that the utility would not accommodate this size of an array. And there's likely some chance that this may be too sloped of an area. Again, this is a conceptual model. There need to be certainly some engineering done to get to the next stage. This would show perhaps maybe a more likely model of a reduced array, again, given the capacity. And I'm going to talk to you in a moment about the process of going into the grid and what that means further. So again, highlighting those are completely conceptual illustrations. So the DEC has recently issued guidance very specific to solar arrays on closed landfill sites. There's many closed landfill sites across New York State, hundreds of them. So what typically would happen would be an application meeting with them. Of course, this would all be pending this board's approval to proceed with a plan for a project of this type. Basically outline to them where the array would generally fit on the property, as well as discussions on to a degree, the nature in which the landfill was closed. And what I mean by that, a cap that ultimately was placed over the waste mass. Typically, that could, and for this site's case, probably be on the order of a foot of some clay and pervious material, followed by topsoil, undoubtedly, and then, of course, you have your grass cover. So what they'll want to see, as I mentioned, is a potential modification to the closure plan. Given the history of this site and its age that I'm aware of, it likely didn't have a formal closure plan per se. And in that case, if it's suitable, what would need to be done, as you can see here under item 5, would be an engineering report. And I'll get to that next. Item 4, as you can see, would be construction level plans, much more detailed than what I show here conceptually. As far as the engineering report, I mentioned that they're very concerned with stability, what's going to happen on top of the cap. They want to know about wind and snow loading. I will suggest to you that the snow does the panels a favor. It actually washes the dust and the dirt off the panels, as does the rain. Whereas in Texas and Arizona, for example, you actually have to go in and clean them. The state is also interested in the environmental monitoring infrastructure around the landfill. That includes monitoring wells. I suspect that perhaps the state may more recently have been at this landfill doing some sampling of the groundwater. So they'll want to make sure that those parts and pieces of wells and gas vents that we're going to talk about are remaining intact. The next slide I'm going to share with you after this is a discussion about construction techniques to ensure that low impact equipment is on the cap and again, not, or if you will, protecting the integrity of that cap. And they're going to want to hear about stormwater management as well as a contingency plan. So the next slide, as I submit, is a photographic representation of what I'll call the DEC preferences for these projects on closed landfills. The upper left-hand corner is the deployment of gravel across the landfill on a membrane, as you can see, and with a rubber-tracked piece of equipment. The next illustration in the middle is the ballasted system. So there's no penetration even into the topsoil, as you can see. So it moves from the lining, the gravel placement, and then the ballast, and then what's called the racking, which is the aluminum structures that ultimately the panels will fit into. The unit on the far right is what's called an inverter. So this power comes out of this system in a direct current, which is consistent with a battery. What we have coming into the building is an alternating current. So these inverters are in the process of converting that electrical energy. The lower left-hand corner is a gas vent. Presumably, I believe this site has a few of those. This is nothing more than allowing the gases to vent from the site in a passive way. The final illustration in the bottom right-hand corner is showing that further how the wiring and the installation occurs electrically. Again, there's no penetration into the cap. This is all raised above the cap in a gravel type membrane. I would submit to you as I go along here that these panels effectively have a life of 20 to 22 years. The inverters would be somewhere around the 15-year mark. I'm going to suggest that these panels are not that different than computers. So it's likely that perhaps in 10 or 12 years, if another set of panels that are more efficient come into the market, and the developer that we're working with on the project might decide, let's take those out. I believe, I do work for the United Nations overseas, I believe there's a market for these materials with still salvage value to be deployed into third world countries. And you're going to see more and more of these solar deployments across New York State. You may or may not be aware of the governor's Renewable Energy Vision, the REV program. So we now have a law that suggests by 2030, 30% of our electricity is going to come from renewable resources. And then by 2050, 50% will come from renewable resources. That would include wind and solar, hydroelectric, and things of that nature. So I would argue that we're only so many wind resources in our state. We have a fair amount of resources for solar. There is certainly a debate currently across the state about the utilization of agricultural land for solar. And I would argue that this again exemplifies the use of a landfill as best practice in regard to land use. As it relates to permitting, what's typically happening, and I'm involved in quite a bit of across the state right now, is a local process, a site plan approval that would involve a seeker, a state environmental quality review determination. The DEC actually allows for an exemption of seeker for a closed landfill installation as long as it's less than 25 acres. I'm not here tonight to in any way advocate that. I'm just suggesting to you what's available currently in the way of development. One thing I did mention about an incentive, I said financial incentive. There's an additional payment made for landfills that produce solar that's produced at a landfill. So if you were building a solar project in a cornfield or in a brownfield or greenfield, an open lot, you'd get less money than you would building in a landfill. So there's what's called a state SHPO, Historic Preservation Consultation. That's basically a cultural resource investigation to determine if there was any archaeological significance. I would submit to you at a landfill that's highly unlikely. In my experience, there'd be presumably a building permit process following a site plan application, and would suggest certainly aware of your ordinance and things of that nature that are in the works, conceivably. Some projects require zoning variance, depending upon certain aspects of the site associated with fencing, for example, or landscaping, which as you can see, this site is almost completely landscaped. Then there's other permitting I made some reference to on wetlands. We have a long-eared bat in our neighborhoods, and those are protected species. I don't suspect that this property in this area is a habitat for these bats, but these are areas that somewhat have to be mapped. There are prohibitions about when trees can be taken down, depending upon whether the habitat has been identified or not. Lastly, before I turn it over to any questions I suspect there may be, how this process would work, or what I propose would be a lease option agreement that would allow for much of the development activities that I mentioned to occur, in particular and most importantly with the utility. There's a process of filing an interconnection application with them that would include the site layout as well as some additional aspects, what's called an electrical 3-line drawing, which just shows how all the parts and pieces come together. The town's consent would be needed for that initial application. The utility would come back with a study, and that study would say, yes, this circuit is sufficient to connect to. I would submit to you that you need a robust 3-phase circuit to do that. Based on my initial investigation, that is feasible for this site. I wouldn't really be here if it wasn't. So that at least is an advantage, that there's the proximity to connect, not too far away. And then after that, there's a more formal submission that would go into the utility with a fair bit more money, that they would do a much more in-depth study. So that takes on a life of its own, as much as this process through permitting that we just went through, including somewhat laborious discussions and activities with the DEC. All of that would lead to hopefully a success in a 6-month window of positives on what I had just mentioned, at which point typically there'd be a payment to the town for the option agreement, and all of which would lead toward development and execution of a longer-term lease for the property. Under that lease, there would be protections for both parties, there'd be provisions for insurance, there'd be provisions about who's responsible for what in the way of operation and maintenance. Another advantage of these projects is they're relatively passive. After construction, there's minimal traffic coming into the facility. From time to time, there may be an individual coming in to do some landscaping. These projects have actually been blended with livestock, with sheep that actually take care of the grass, with bees that are cultivated or pollinated, if you will, throughout the arrays. So we've seen that kind of activity. There'd also be clear understanding of the decommissioning responsibilities, so that in 20 or 25 years from now, there's a clear direction on these things being moved off of the property. And then, of course, a clear definition on responsibilities. I'm remiss in sharing numbers with you tonight on lease payment amounts that could come to the town, and the only reason I'm remiss in that is, again, goes back to the size that the utility would ultimately allow. I would submit to you that those payments would likely be on the order of, again, this is completely conservative, I'm just gonna give you a range. That could be on the order of $6,000 to $7,000 per year, up to as much as $12,000 a year for a project of this type.
How many megawatts?
So that's all predicated on how much can fit into the grid. So right now, I would suggest to you that the larger array is on the order of about 5, if not 6 megawatts, depending upon how much we're able to expand this outward. Again, our goal, the project's goal is to take no trees down. And that would all be a function of what I mentioned. This would be closer to, let's say 3 megawatts between the two panels. And again, this is completely conceptual. It could be such that again, this is a foundation for an old building, but certainly flat. There could very well be an opportunity to do some additional layout here. My suspicion, I've not been on this property to speak of in my career, but I could clearly see that there's a slope, and this area may not be friendly, if you will, for the reasons stated. However, you really have potential for a great array to the extent the utility can host this much. So I'm going to stop there. I suspect you might have other questions for me.
Can you recall the size of that building? Recall the size of the array?
Other cover? I don't, because we've never had a proposal to use the covered area. All proposals for solar in particular, have been to utilize 30 acres of flat land.
Yeah.
And why would you
And not go over.
why would you go over a cover if you didn't have to?
So I can't answer that. So there's a provision in the state that's called an Article 10 provision. So if you make electricity, however you do it, whether it's wind, biogas, solar, hydroelectric, waste energy, as long as you make 25 megawatts, you are entitled to follow this process. And
Right.
some of these
That's
larger.
that's a siting process.
Right, correct. It's handled through the state.
Right. But you're talking about 2 to 3 kilowatts. And you're talking
Yeah, this is nothing close to what you.
But what of these different facilities that you have developed or you helped in the development, assisted in the development throughout our area, how many of them are owned by municipalities?
So, thank you, I meant to cover that. So there's different types of solar projects. There's a project which is called community solar, where the output would get distributed to its members. So in a large sense, I'm just going to completely talk in theory, that if this were, let's say the town had an interest in the project, maybe this much of the array went toward powering this building, the DPW garage, the library, et cetera, maybe you throw in an industry, the hospital. You could get into residential. Your question is very valid. There has been a project that was done on a community level that included residential. So it allowed subscribers from, just to be clear, you don't have to have the array connected in your backyard. So as long as you're connected with a meter to the utility and have a meter number, you're able to subscribe through this community solar program, which there's only a few subscriptions that the utility will allow. So there is some time sensitivity because the windows for these community opportunities open and close. And there have been a significant amount of subscribers, and we foresee that the window's gonna open again in the near term and then close again. So keep that in mind as it relates to the opportunity. So to answer your question, there are a means to do them owned publicly, and there's more so a means to own them privately. Right now, there's about 4 years left on the production tax credit through Congress. It's unclear whether that credit will be extended again. So I don't want to take up too much of the board's time, so we could talk much more about this as we go here, if you will, as long as there's interest. There's an opportunity to pursue a bond, there's an opportunity to pursue funding.